Hello and welcome to Narayana IS. I'm Pratik, your faculty for Indian Polity. Students, so far we have completed 4 chapters. I hope you understood each and every chapter. And which are the 4 chapters that we completed? The first one was on historical foundation of the Indian society. In this chapter, I hope you must have understood how history has influenced the governance models. Right? We have seen the governance structure in the ancient part, in the ancient era, in the medieval era, in the modern era. Then we discussed about the society because in polity, whichever topics we study is meant for the society. So we understood about our society, the characteristics of the Indian society, and then in the third chapter, we discussed the political theories. We understood the meaning of freedom, equality, fraternity, justice, right? And then in the fourth chapter, we started with the understanding of key term, that is democracy and diversity. How democracy manages diversity, right? These are the 4 chapters that we completed. And today, the chapter that we shall be starting with is the fifth chapter, that is the constitutional design, right? So here by mistake I have mentioned 4. It is the fifth chapter, that is constitutional design. Now, in this chapter, we'll understand what exactly is constitution. What do you mean by constitution? Why each and every country strives to have a constitution? What do the constitution entails or provides? Right? And then in the Indian context, we'll understand about the Indian constitution. And this topic is important because UPSC often asks questions from this chapter. When I say this chapter, it is often the mix of NCERT and the advanced GS book. But this chapter will help you understand the advanced topics mentioned in the advanced GS book. Right? So, if you see, the first question, in India, which one of the following constitutional amendments was widely believed to be enacted to overcome the judicial interpretation of fundamental rights? Did the Government of India Act 1935 lay down a federal constitution? So, you will understand the meaning of key terms like federal constitution. This was asked in 2016. Then compare and contrast the British and Indian approaches to parliament sovereignty. What is the difference between the parliamentary sovereignty India has and its difference with the British political model? Then again, a question was asked in 2018. So again, the point is UPSC often focuses on such topics, and that's the reason understanding this topic becomes very, very important. So students, let us begin the fifth chapter. Name of the chapter is Constitutional Design. Now, what is constitution? Constitution is the highest law of a country. What is it? It's the highest it is the highest law of the country. The constitution explains how a nation is governed, how a nation is to be managed, how a nation is to be governed. The constitution is nothing but it's a document. It sets up the government's structure, how the government will function, the structure of government. Then it divides powers among institutions. For example, the legislature makes laws, the government, the executive, they execute the laws, judiciary interprets the laws, and then it also protects the citizens' rights. Now, in a democracy, right, it is expected for the rulers to follow constitutional limits, which means the rulers, the government, cannot go beyond the constitutional provisions. They have to abide by the constitutional provisions. And then the Indian constitution also provides for a system that prevents the misuse of power, which means, let's say, tomorrow the Indian government cannot make a law stating that henceforth in India, people won't be equal. People of one religion will be superior, people of one caste will be superior. They cannot make such law. They simply cannot make such law. Why? Because they would violate the constitution. That's the reason the no government, whichever government forms in the future, no government will be able to make such changes. Why? Because it violates the constitution. So, is it possible to amend the constitution? Is a question that we'll address in the following part. Now, in this chapter, right, we'll understand or why a constitution is important. We'll understand the importance of constitution, how the constitution is created, which are the values that shapes the constitution, and is it possible to change the constitution. Now, just for better understanding, we have also sort of will understand the constitution of South Africa. We'll try to understand how nations overcome oppression, right? Oppression, that is torture, and let's say the rule of the colonial powers. How the nations have overcome such persecution, and then they have fought, why? To ensure justice and equality. Right. The first and foremost question is, why do we need a constitution? Why do we need a constitution? What is the importance of constitution? Can't we function without constitution? Is it mandatory for the countries to have constitution? We do not know. Now see, why do we need a constitution? Because the constitution provides a clear system of governance. It provides a clear system of governance, which means clear system of governance. There will be different, let's say, departments, different institutions, the responsibility of each and every institution. So it sets a clear system of governance. For example, which are the subjects or which are the issues the central government will look into it, which are the issues the state government will look into, and by having a clear system of governance, the constitution tries to establish stability. How? It sets the basic rules for decision making, which means who has the power to make the decisions. Do I have the power to make a decision? No. Tomorrow, once you clear the examination, once you be an IS officer, you will be in a position to take decisions with respect to the jurisdiction of which you are in charge of. And if you do not have constitution, then there will be power struggle. Everyone will fight for power. And if everyone fights for power, because there is no constitution, we do not know who takes the decision. And if this power struggle, it will lead to disorder. Disorder in the society, people will start killing each other, hitting each other. That's the reason we need constitution. The constitution also limits the government's power. It does not allow the government to become authoritarian, which means there are checks and balances. The constitution ensures there are checks and balances which ensures that the government does not become authoritarian. The government does not become authoritarian or dictate. And how? The constitution has also given the individuals the rights and freedoms. For example, equality, freedom of expression, then freedom of religion. So the constitution ensures that citizens are also given legal rights, which means if the government, let's say, takes away your rights, then you can approach the judiciary. You can approach the judiciary. So it also gives you legal rights. Now, the constitution also reflects society's goals. What? It also reflects the goals of society's goals. And which are the goals of a country? That is justice, justice for everyone, equality, progress, modernity, development. So constitution also reflects the goals of the society. Now, in the post-colonial countries like India, or for that matter South Africa, constitution is symbol of freedom. Constitution is a symbol of, it's a symbol of freedom and empowerment. Constitution, right? Because countries like India and South Africa, they have, you know, they have separated themselves, or it's a breakaway from the past persecution, right? And then now we are heading freedom. Now we are heading towards, nation building, right? That's the reason we need to have a constitution, right? So having a constitution is important. Why? Because it ensures the citizens have the freedom, they have the rights, they have the liberty to pursue their professions, to pursue their wishes, aspirations. And then there are certain roles and responsibilities given as such. Who will govern the nation? Which are the powers, the checks and balances? So the constitution helps a country to be, or the constitution helps a country achieve stability. Stability is important for development. So in order for the country to develop, prosper, we need constitution, because constitution ensures that each and everyone are enjoying their rights, each and everyone are performing their duties, so that through rights and duties, country prospers, country blossoms. I hope you understood why do we need a constitution. Now let us try to understand the democratic constitution in South Africa. How it was difficult for South Africa, right, to have their own constitution. Democratic constitution in South Africa. Now South Africa followed an apartheid system. They followed an apartheid system, which means this was a system of racial segregation. Segregation, division on the basis of color, skin color. This segregation denied the black majority basic rights. So, system where it was a system, segregation, division between the whites and the blacks. Whites and the blacks. The whites were in minority. They were in minority, less in numbers, and they were in majority. Despite the blacks were in majority, they were denied basic rights. They were denied basic rights. This white minority, the whites who are in minority, they control the government. The white minority, they control the government, and non-whites, that is the blacks, they face legal discrimination, which means they did not have access to education, jobs, housing. This is how they were discriminated. They were not even allowed to vote. They were not even allowed to vote. And there were separate public places only where the blacks could, occupy. And then came a famous personality. Then came a famous personality in Nelson Mandela, the torch bearer of freedom for the blacks. Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, the party he was heading, they led the fight against apartheid. This movement, the African National Congress movement for freedom, was suppressed, right? Which means it was banned, and then Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 28 years, which means he was behind the bars for 28 years. But as the international pressure and the mass people started protesting, the whites who were in minority, they had no option but they had ensured that this white supremacy cannot continue. This white supremacy cannot continue. And finally, in the year 1994, apartheid was banned. It was banned in South Africa. Finally. And Nelson Mandela, he became the South Africa's first black president. First black president. And then the new democratic constitution that was created in South Africa. It was created through discussions between the former rulers and the oppressed community. See, now finally Nelson Mandela, he becomes the president. He becomes the president. Once South Africa banned apartheid, now the former rulers, the whites and the oppressed blacks, they came together to discuss how the future constitution should look like. And finally, in the year 1996, the constitution was established for South Africa. It is considered one of the most, progressive constitutions in the world. Why? Because it guaranteed equal rights for all. It banned racial discrimination. It established democratic governance. Now, unlike the many revolutions happened in different parts of the world, unlike many revolutions that have happened in different parts of the world, right? Where the new rulers after revolution, the one who came in power, they sought revenge against the ones who oppressed them. But South Africa, it did not seek for revenge. It chose reconciliation. It chose what? Reconciliation. It did not. Now the blacks, Nelson Mandela did not punish the whites. Reconciliation. The constitution aimed to heal the past wounds rather than punish the whites. And South Africa's experience shows that the constitution is not just a legal document. It is not a legal document, but it is a tool for social change. What? It is a tool for social change. It it is a tool through which society can be changed. It ensures that past injustices are not repeated in the future. Past injustices, wrongs are not repeated in the future, and the structure, the governance would be built on fairness, equality, and most importantly, through democratic means. I hope you understood why do we need a constitution and the democratic constitution in South Africa. Now students will understand the fundamental identity of a nation. What exactly is the fundamental identity of a nation, right? Now, we know that constitution is not just a legal document. It is more than a set of laws. Legal document, what is it? It's a set of laws for governance. The constitution also defines a nation's identity. Constitution, it defines a nation's identity. How? So the constitution, it sets shared values, norms, principles, which means it unites diverse people while respecting their individual identities. When I say the constitution sets shared values, right? Shared values, norms, principles. What do you mean by shared norms? Which are the norms? For example, the constitution shares common norms. Values. Which are the values? Liberty, equality, then fraternity, dignity of individuals. Values. Which are the norms? Rule of law, secularism, federalism, separation of power. We'll understand all these terms, don't worry. Democratic representation, that is, rulers are elected by the people. And principles, which are the principles? Sovereignty, independence, fundamental rights, the directive principles of state policy, judicial independence. These are the common principles. We'll understand each and every term, don't worry. Which means the constitution, it sets shared values, norms, principles. And by setting the common values or shared values, norms and principles, it unites diverse people, which means people, there's diversity in the society. So the constitution unites diverse people. Why? Because nations have various ethnic, religious, linguistic and cultural groups, which means every nation is diverse. Different religions, customs, culture, language, cultural groups, and each and every group have their own traditions and history. Every group has their own traditions and history. And a constitution helps create a common identity despite diversity, which means a constitution shapes how these groups, different cultural groups, they interact with each other and the state. So we have different, groups, how they should interact with each other and with the state. The constitution defines citizenship. The constitution ensures there is justice in the society. There's democracy. And most importantly, each and every section is included in the, let's say, elections, development, and most importantly, the constitution tries to maintain national unity. What? National unity. Now we'll understand constitution and the formation of national identity. Now see, we know that constitution unites a society. How? By creating common governance framework. Now this common governance framework, for example, we have the federalism. The power is divided between the center and the states. Right? This is a common governance framework. We have, let's say, the constitution has defined the rights of the citizens, the fundamental duties, responsibilities of citizens. It acts as a moral and ethical guide. Constitution, it acts as moral and ethical guide. It limits the state power. It ensures that the state power is limited, and it also ensures people enjoy freedom, equality, justice. The constitution also reflects country's history and political journey. Country's history and political, what does it mean? It essentially means that, for example, let's say Indian constitution is shaped by colonial rule and the freedom movement. The Indian constitution is shaped by the colonial rule and the freedom movement, which means the Indian constitution, or let's say the Indian constitution focuses on democracy, secularism, social justice. Similarly, which means the Indian constitution is shaped by the colonial rule. And of course, during the colonial period, people, the freedom fighters were fighting for freedom, right? Similarly, South Africa's constitution. It is influenced by the fight against apartheid. Apartheid, that is the segregation, racial segregation between the whites and the blacks. And this influenced the South African constitution. And so the South African constitution has strong protections for racial equality and human rights. So the history of each and every country, the experiences, the learnings, it influences the constitution of that country. So all the problems that we faced during the British Raj, we try to rectify it through the constitution by mentioning it in constitution. Now let us try to understand the different conceptions of national identity. Which are the different conceptions of national identity? See, most of the modern constitutions, they support democratic values. They support democratic values. They define national identity differently. National identity is defined differently based on their history in politics. Based on the history, just now we discussed. Let's take an example. Now the basic law of Germany, the basic law of Germany framed in the year 1949. Germany. This law, it linked citizenship to ethnicity, which means only those people who belong to a particular ethnic group can be German citizens. It gave automatic rights or citizenship to ethnic Germans. But of course, with time, it adopted a more inclusive model, that is even, people from other countries or let's say other ethnic groups can also become German citizens now. In contrast to this, if you say the Indian constitution does not base national identity, which means the identity of a country is not based on, let's say, ethnicity, religion, caste. The identity of a country is not based on these parochial terms, narrow terms. Citizenship in a country is defined by birth or legal residence, which means anyone having proper documents, regardless of the language, culture, religion, caste, can become Indian citizen, which means this is an inclusive approach. This is an inclusive approach. Now let us discuss about the Indian constitution in detail. Now, the Indian constitution shapes national identity. How? It respects the diversity. Which diversity? Regional diversity, religious diversity, cultural diversity. We did not enforce a single identity. We did not say that you have to belong to this identity if you want to be a part of India. We did not enforce a single identity. We promoted unity in diversity. We said that you retain your individual identity. We don't have any problem with it. But your adherence has to be to the country. So you can be a Muslim, still you can be loyal to India. You can be a Hindu, stay loyal to India. You can be a Christian, you can stay loyal to India. The Indian constitution rejects separate electorates. It rejects separate. What do you mean by separate electorate? Which means a Muslim candidate can be voted only by Muslims. A Hindu candidate fighting elections, contesting elections will be voted only by a Hindu. We rejected separate electorates, which means people of each and every religion can vote the Hindu, Muslim, Christian candidate. And this strengthens national unity. This strengthens national unity. Then through federalism, what is federalism? That is division of power between the center and the states. Through federalism, the constitution allows regional autonomy, which means the states have their own powers within their own rights. Right? So this federal model, it allowed regional autonomy while maintaining a strong national structure. Now, unlike the American federalism, the Indian constitution follows a asymmetrical model. Asymmetrical model. What is asymmetrical model? Which means the division in America, the division between center and the states is uniform across the country. But in our country, it is not symmetrical, it is asymmetrical. What does it mean? Which means, for example, let's take an example. Article 370. This Article 370 allowed the state of Jammu and Kashmir, former state, to have their own constitution, which means through Article 370, Jammu Kashmir as a state, former state, had more autonomy or more independence. Now, many people think that Jammu Kashmir was the only state to have this special power. Under Article under Article 371, we have almost 10 states that have or that enjoy special power or special autonomy. Right? For example, we have states in the northeast. Right? Now they enjoy more independence than the other states. The point is, based on the, let's say, characteristics of a society, based on the diversity of a society, we allowed for the provision like asymmetrical federalism, which allows the different groups manage their own system or manage or govern their own cultural aspects. Then the constitution also protects minority rights. Article 25 to 28, it guarantees the cultural and education freedom to minorities, which means now minorities includes both religious as well as linguistic minorities. In the fourth chapter, we discussed the difference between religious and you know linguistic minorities. So, minority includes religious as well as linguistic minorities. These minorities have the right to preserve their culture, be it language, be it script, be it their culture. Now, the fourth part, national identity and the governance structure. How is the governance structure? The relationship between the central and the regional government, federalism, it plays a very important role. Why? Because it shapes the national identity, the relation between the center and the regional units. For example, France. Now, France is a country that follows a unitary system where the power is centralized in the hands of the central government. Now, tell me, in our country, are all the powers in the hands of the central government? No. The states have their own powers. The municipalities, the Panchayati Raj system have their own powers. In France, it follows a centralized structure. Countries like Canada and United States, they follow a federal system where power is shared between the center and the regional units. It allows for regional autonomy. States have their own independence, but it ensures that the national unity is maintained. Now, India's governance structure, that is India's federal model. India's federal model is very unique. It is very unique. It balances strong central authority with regional autonomy, which means states have their own rights, have their own powers, right? But it also ensures that there is national unity. This balance between unity and diversity has been, or rather has helped our country. For example, how a country is unique? Our country is unique because our country at times can become unitary. For example, let's say when China attacks our country, then emergency can be imposed in the entire country. When emergency is imposed and all the powers are in the hands of the central government, all the powers, they fall in the hands of the central government. When president's rule is imposed in a state, the state, that state would lose their regional autonomy, which means the federal model is unique, which means according to the situation, according to circumstance, our country may become unitary or may remain federal. I hope you understood the fundamental identity of a nation, right? Now, students, let us try to understand how the Indian Constitution came into being, the making of the Indian Constitution. Now, the making of the Indian Constitution. If you see the Indian Constitution, the way it was made under very, very difficult conditions. Why? Because our country was partitioned. Right? When the British left India, our country was partitioned after India's independence from the British rule. Now, the drafting of the Indian Constitution, right? The drafting of the Indian Constitution, it involved detailed discussion, not like the discussion that we have today. So these discussions were drawn from India's nationalist movement. All the experiences we experienced during the colonial Raj, experiences of the colonial rule, and also we compared the constitutions of the world. And finally, the constitution was formed in the year 1940. The Constituent Assembly was formed in the year Constituent Assembly. Why? The purpose of the Constituent Assembly was to frame the constitution. It was responsible for creating a constitution, right? And after long debates, right, which went on for about uh, three and a half years, the constitution was finally adopted in the year 1949. The constitution was finally adopted in the year 1949, that is 26 November 1949, and it was brought into practice. It was brought into practice, which means our constitution was ready on 26 November 1949, but the implementation started in the year 1950. Essentially, now we'll discuss in detail, right? Essentially, the Indian constitution, the way it was framed, was made under very difficult conditions. Why? Because our country was partitioned, right? Partitioned on religious lines. There was great amount of illiteracy in our country, right? And then to accommodate the interests of so many diverse sections was very, very difficult. Given the diversity India has, or rather had, it was very, very difficult for the members of Constituent Assembly to frame a constitution that can satisfy the aspirations of each and every section of the society. Because if the constitution is only satisfying, let's say, few groups at the cost of other groups, then people will never accept the constitution. And that's the reason despite the diversity. The reason why India has remained a successful functioning democracy, the credit goes to the ones who made our constitution. Very few people understand or appreciate, acknowledge the members of the Constituent Assembly and their contribution. Let us try to understand how the Constituent Assembly got formed. What is Constituent Assembly? This body was responsible to frame, to draft the Indian Constitution. This Constituent Assembly CA was elected in the year July 1946. India was still under the British rule. The first session was held in the month of December 1946. The elections were held in July 1946. First meeting was held in the month of December 1946. But after partition in the year August 1947, the assembly was divided into two. Now, there were two constituent assemblies. One for India, the other one for Pakistan. One for India, the other one for Pakistan. The Constituent Assembly, it continued its works with 299 members. Why? Because now the strength got reduced. Why? Because now another country came into being. This Constituent Assembly, it represented different, which means people from different communities, religions, political groups, different regions, north, south, east, west, were all a part of Constituent Assembly. They were all a part of the Constituent Assembly. The elections were indirect, which means people did not choose the members of Constituent Assembly. Now, I'll tell you how the members were elected. Now, as of now, we know that India has, let's say this is India, this is India. We have different states. We have different states. Similar, and these are referred to as states. Similarly, back then, our country was divided into different provinces. Every state has a legislative assembly, Vidhan Sabha. Back then, every province had a provincial legislative assembly. Which means the members of each provincial legislative assembly, or let's say Vidhan Sabha, they elected the members of Constituent Assembly. The common people did not elect. The members of provincial legislative assemblies, these members voted the members of the Constituent Assembly. The elections were indirect. Why? Because people did not elect the members of Constituent Assemblies. And these provincial legislative assemblies were set up under the law made by the British. These assemblies were, set up under the Government of India Act 1935. Government of India Act 1935. Now the seats to each and every province was based on population. For example, in India's parliament, majority of the members are from Uttar Pradesh. Why? Because Uttar Pradesh has more population. Similarly, the seats in the Constituent Assembly, was based on population. So if let's say Uttar Pradesh has more members, so more members would be represented in the Central Assembly, Constituent Assembly, which means it ensured representation, right? It ensured proportional representation. The Constituent Assembly aimed to be a socially and politically inclusive, which means it ensured that people from different religions, different castes, the scheduled tribes, all are represented in the Constituent Assembly. Each and every member of different groups are represented in the Constituent Assembly. Now we know that partition had caused major disruption. It is considered to be one of the major tragedies in the world. And then because of partition, we had two Constituent Assemblies. Post partition, thousands of people were killed because of communal violence, because of mass migration. But the assembly continued its work. It shows India's commitment to democracy and nation building. Now, one key reason for the legitimacy of the Indian Constitution, one reason why people accepted Indian Constitution, why? Because the Constitution was made by the freedom fighters. The Constitution was made by the freedom fighters, which means the ones who fought for the country, they framed Indian Constitution. It wasn't the fact like it happened in different countries that the ruling elites, they framed the constitution to suit their interest. But in India, the people who fought for our independence like Dr. Ambedkar, Nehru, Sardar Patel, Maulana Azad, Rajendra Prasad, these people actually played a very, very important role in the framing of our constitution. In the framing of our constitution. This is how our constituent assembly came into being. Right? Now we'll understand the influence of the nationalist movement. Influence of the nationalist movement on the Indian Constitution. On the Indian Constitution. Now see, the nationalist movement, they not only fought for independence, but they also shaped for the ideals of our how our Indian Constitution should be. For example, the demand for universal adult franchise, which means everyone who is above 18 should have the right to vote, social justice, rights of the minorities. So all this demand or all these ideals, equality, justice, minority rights, they were rooted in the freedom struggle. They were rooted in the freedom struggle. Which ideals? Liberty, equality, minority rights, justice. How? For example, now there were few key documents or documents that influenced the development of the constitution. For example, the Nehru report of 1928. The Nehru report of 1928. Now this report of 1928, which was drafted by Motilal Nehru, father of Jawaharlal Nehru. This report, it called for fundamental rights, which means this report, it demanded fundamental rights, responsible government, that is government working for the welfare of the Indian people, and complete independence. Then the Karachi resolution of 1931, the Karachi resolution of 19. Now this resolution, it emphasized economic and social justice. Economic and social justice, which means it asks for workers' rights, the rights of the workers, then gender equality, and most importantly, abolition of untouchability. Abolition of untouchability. Then the objective resolution of 1946. The objective resolution of 1946, it was introduced by Jawaharlal Nehru. Now this actually resolution was a foundation of Indian Constitution. Why? Because how the Indian Constitution should be framed was mentioned in this objective resolution. For example, concepts like sovereignty, independence, democracy, liberty, equality, justice, preamble, which means if you see These nationalist reports, these influence the formation of our Indian constitution. Now, India's colonial experience also helped our country to draft the Indian constitution. For example, the Government of India Act, the laws made by the British, for example, 1919, 1935, it also influenced the making of the constitution. Why? Because the Government of India Act 1919, 35, it introduced limited electoral democracy, which means even the Indians were represented in the elections, in the Parliament, Central Legislative Assembly, but power, the major power remained with the British. So we actually learn from all these failures made during the British rule. And then the Indian leaders ensured that the new constitution India will have all the essential features required meant for the development of country. Same, universal adult franchise, liberty, equality, etc. etc. Now we also were inspired by global constitutions, right? Global constitutions, which means, for example, the global models. For example, we the French Revolution. Now, from French Revolution, we learned the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this is what we borrowed from the French Constitution Revolution. Then the American Bill of Rights. The American Bill of Rights. Now this American Bill of Rights is nothing but fundamental rights. Then the socialistic models from Russia. So Russia, America, France, which means we simply did not copy. We actually use these provisions to suit India's society, which could fit into India's unique social and cultural, norms or context. This is how the nationalist movement also influenced the making of the Indian constitution. Then we'll understand the deliberations and the democratic process. Now, as I told you, the way Indian constitution was made was very, very democratic. Why? Because discussions were held with different sections of the society. Each and every provision of the Indian constitution was debated. Each and every, now who drafted, which department drafted the Indian constitution? It was the drafting committee. It was the drafting committee. And who was the chairman of drafting committee? Baba Saheb Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Baba Saheb Ambedkar is considered to be one of the highly qualified individual, not only in our country but in the world. He had degrees in 17 subjects, 17 different subjects. He was a polymath. Now people find it difficult to graduate in one subject. He graduated in 17 different subjects. Most qualified person. He studied the constitutions of different countries and saw which model or which provision of which country's constitution could fit in India's context. And it took 3 years. How many? 3 years. 3 years. 11 sessions and 166 days. And finally, after 3 years of intense debate, consultation, discussion, finally our constitution came into being. Now, the Constituent Assembly, right, the drafting committee, they focused on key terms like federalism, right, democratic process, federalism. That is whether India should have a strong central government or it should adopt a federal model. Then which kind of fundamental rights should the Indian state have? How the Indian state should balance the individual freedom with state authority. Then how the representation, that is how the minority should be represent, how the minorities and different sections will be represented in, let's say, in the parliament. Then whether we need to have an independent judiciary or integrated judiciary. Then which are the provisions we need to have to enforce economic and social justice. How do we address the inequality in our society? Which kind of policies we need to adopt? So it wasn't the case that there were no differences. There was a huge amount of difference, or there were differences in the discussions, in the negotiations. But the differences were based on logic, rational, not guided by political interest. Not guided by political interest. So in a matter of 3 years, 2000 amendments were made to the original draft of the Indian Constitution. And finally, after 2000 amendments, our Constitution was finally ready. Our Constitution was finally ready. Then comes the adoption and legacy. Finally, our Constitution was adopted when, which date? 26th November 1949, our Constitution was adopted. It came into effect when 26th Jan 1950. Now, why was this date chosen? Even on this date, the Constitution could have been enforced. But the reason why we chose this date is because to commemorate, to celebrate Purna Swaraj, Purna Swaraj resolution, which was taken in the year 1930. So to celebrate Purna Swaraj, this resolution of 1930, we actually postponed from this date to this date. And as we all know that the Indian Constitution is the world's longest and most detailed constitution. It's inclusive. Why? Because it has provisions for each and every section of the society, and the way it was drafted democratically, it ensured that there is wide acceptance from different sections of the society. And to this date, India is among the few countries, India is among few countries which has been successful in maintaining the constitution and ensuring that the constitution is functional. Very few countries have a successful functioning constitution, and India is one among those few countries. Most of the countries who framed the constitution could not, or the constitution did not meet the aspirations of different sections, so the constitution was not accepted. Even to this date, if anything goes wrong, or if the government is making a law which goes against the constitution, people will say that let us go to the court. Why? In court will prove you that the law that you made is violating the Indian constitution. I hope you understood how the Indian constitution was drafted, right? So now, students, let us start with the key features of the Indian constitution, right? Now, the Indian constitution, right? We know that it's a detailed and comprehensive document. Why? Because it lays the foundation for governance, and it also has borrowed many features from the other constitutions, right? We simply have not blindly copied the provisions of different constitutions, but we have borrowed so as to suit and meet India's needs and interests. So the key feature is to ensure a balance of power, protect individual rights, and guide governance how through the directive principles of state policy. Now we'll understand the borrowed elements of the Indian Constitution. Borrowed elements of the Indian Constitution, right? We discussed that Dr. Ambedkar, he studied various different constitutions of the world and then decided which constitution to be used to suit or meet the India's interest. So if I talk about the British Constitution, one is the parliamentary system. The parliamentary system that we see in our country today at the central level, state level, that is the executive is accountable to the legislature, which means the government is accountable to the parliament. The state government is accountable to the Vidhan Sabha. Parliamentary system. This we borrowed from the British Constitution. Then the second one is rule of law. Rule of law. That is adherence to law. No one, including the government, is above the law. Everyone has to abide by the law, be it a poor person or the president. Then bicameralism. Which means Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So at the center we have bicameral structure, but not every state has bicameral structure. Then how to pass, let's say how to pass a bill, the role of cabinet government, all these provisions are borrowed from the British Constitution. Now let's discuss about the US Constitution. We have the fundamental rights, the American Bill of Rights. In America, it is referred to as Bill of Rights. Then we have the concept of judicial review. What is judicial review? Which means whenever Parliament makes a law, judiciary has the power to review the law made by the Parliament. The judiciary will interpret whether a law made by the Parliament is as per the provisions of the Constitution. Any decision, any law, any action the government takes, the judiciary has the power to review the decision. This is referred to as judicial review. The judiciary ensures that no law is arbitrary, no action taken by the government is arbitrary, that is going against the provisions of the Indian Constitution. Then we'll discuss about the French Constitution. Now we discussed the concepts such as liberty, equality, fraternity. What is fraternity? Bhaichara, brotherhood. So these actually ideals shaped the preamble of the Indian Constitution. So in the preamble, you'll come across these words. Then we have the Irish Constitution from, now we borrowed DPSP. What is DPSP? Directive Principles of the State Policy. Now what is the DPSP? See, directive principles, which means there are some principles which the Constitution has directed to the government. These are the directions given by the Constitution to the government. That is, the government has to ensure that these principles should be brought into practice. These principles should be brought into practice in the future time or in the due course of time. Essentially, it means that there were some principles, some provisions the Constitution could not make it mandatory. Why? Because we did not have resources when India got free. But these are the principles, for example, to protect the environment, to preserve the water, to preserve the national monuments, to respect the national flag, national anthem. So these are the principles, or let's say to work for the welfare of people, for social and economic justice. There are some principles in the directive principles of state policy the government has to ensure that these principles need to be incorporated whenever they make a law or take any action. Fundamental rights, directive principles will study in the next part of this chapter in detail. Then we have the Canadian Constitution. From Canada, we borrowed the federal model. Now, what is the federal model? We have discussed it many a times. That is, the power is divided between the central government and the regional units. Then we have the residual powers, right? Residuary powers. See, when I say that the Indian Constitution is federal, which means there are powers divided between the center and the regional units. Now, the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution mentions three different types of lists. One is the union list, the second one is state list, and third one is concurrent list, which means the subjects mentioned in the union list, only the union government can frame laws. The subjects mentioned in the state list, only the state government can make laws. And in concurrent list, both the center as well as state can make laws. For example, defense, railways, banking, foreign policy, these subjects are mentioned in the union list, which means only the parliament can make laws. Then state. When it comes to state, for example, law and order, police, agriculture, these are the subjects in state list. Concurrent list, education falls under concurrent list. Now, any subjects which are not part of either this becomes a part of residuary list. And this we borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. And only the Parliament has the power to make a law in the subjects mentioned in the residuary list. I hope you understood which all provisions we have borrowed from which constitutions. Now we'll discuss about the institutional design of the Indian Constitution. We know that the Indian Constitution ensures stability. It ensures that power is not concentrated in the hands of, let's say, in the hands of few people, which means it upholds democracy. Now, the ways through which Constitution ensures that the power is not confined in one segment, these are some checks and balances. For example, first one is separation of power. Separation of power between the legislature, the executive, the legislature, we have the executive, and we have the, which means legislature, parliament. Parliament makes laws. Executive, the government. It implements the laws made by legislature, and judiciary will interpret whether the laws made by legislature or the action taken by executive are constitutional or unconstitutional. This is referred to as separation of power, which means here if you see, the power is not confined either in the hands of legislature, executive and judiciary. Then federalism, we discuss what is federalism. Union list, state list, concurrent list, which means power is divided between the central and the state government, right? We already have discussed this part. Then checks and balances, which means the executive is accountable to legislature. See, in the Indian structure or governance framework, the executive is part of the legislature. The executive is part of the legislature, which means the government is part of the legislature, but not all MPs are part of executive, which means in parliament we have the members of the government and members of opposition. They are referred to as legislators, but only the members who are part of the government, executive, they implement the actions. And legislature has the power to question the executive and hold the executive accountable by asking questions. By asking questions. Now, protection of fundamental rights. Now, this two part, right, we are going to discuss in detail once we are done with the first part of fifth chapter, right? So, fundamental rights, we have 6 fundamental rights we have discussed in the fourth chapter. So, I am not going to discuss in detail each and every provision now, but there is a separate part where we are going to focus on fundamental rights, DPSP, and fundamental duties. Anyways, we had a brief idea about these rights when we discussed the chapter democracy and diversity, right? Uh, Now, students, we shall understand about constitution as a living document. Why is constitution referred to as a living document? Now see, the Indian constitution is referred to as a living document. It's not a dead document. Why? Because the constitution keeps on changing. The constitution keeps on evolving as per the changing needs of the society. How the constitutions are amended? The constitution is amended, then judiciary judiciary gives decisions, judgments, and then the laws made in the Indian Parliament. Now, Indian constitution is not rigid. What do we mean by rigid? Which means it does not ever change. But Indian constitution keeps on changing as per the new challenges, as per the new changes in the society. Which means that the Indian constitution balances rigidity and flexibility. What is rigidity? You cannot change the constitution. And what is flexibility? You can change the constitution at any given point of time. The members who made the Indian constitution ensure that the Indian constitution is neither too rigid nor too flexible. It is neither too rigid nor too flexible. Which essentially means that there are some principles which cannot be changed. There are some principles which cannot be changed, and there are some principles which cannot be changed in the sense it can be changed through a special procedure, and some provisions can be changed easily. For example, the provisions with respect to citizenship, they can be changed very easily. They can be changed very easily. But provisions with respect to fundamental rights, or let's say directive principles, they are, which means you need a special procedure, that is you need a special majority to change the provisions with respect to citizenship. You need simple majority, but to change provisions with respect to fundamental rights, you need special majority, that is two-third majority, right? And there are some provisions which also requires the support from 50% states. Citizenship can be changed with simple majority, that is just 50% majority. Provisions like fundamental rights needs two-third majority. Now provisions like federalism, where the power is divided between center and the state, you need a special majority, that is two-third majority, and you also need the consent from 50% of the states. You need the consent from 50% of the states. Now, then there are provisions which cannot ever be changed. For example, provisions like secularism, federalism, judicial independence, democracy cannot ever be changed. So what we discussed, there are some provisions which can be changed very easily. There are some provisions which requires a special majority. There are some provisions which require special majority plus consent from 50% states, and then there are some provisions which cannot ever be changed. Balancing rigidity and flexibility. Now let's discuss the role of amendments in evolution. How the constitution is changed. The constitution evolves through amendments, which means it allows the government to introduce reforms and address new challenges. Which means constitution can be amended through a special provision mentioned in Article 368. 368. Now let's discuss few amendments made to the Indian Constitution. Now the first amendment was made just 1 year later, that is in the year 1951. The first CAA. What is CAA? Constitutional Amendment Act. Constitutional Amendment Act 1951. Now this allowed reasonable restrictions on fundamental rights, which means fundamental rights cannot be enjoyed in toto, that is altogether. There are restrictions on fundamental rights, which essentially means that in order to enforce land reforms, now see these are some very technical terms which you may understand pretty well when we discuss or start Indian polity. But what is land reforms? We know that until independence, until India got free, because of certain policies of the British, be it Ryotwari system, Mehlwari system, Zamindari system, which we have discussed in the first chapter, these policies actually made the Zamindars very, very rich, which means it actually, these policies were so exploitative that the Zamindars took away the lands of the poor farmers. Many farmers became landless. Now, once India got free, India realized if India has to grow, India has to prosper, everyone needs to have land. It is important for everyone to have land. Only on one's own land people will cultivate, and this will actually ensure food security. And so what the government did is, government took away extra land from the large farmers who had you know land more than, let's say, 100 acres. So government took away the extra land from the farmers, and this extra land collected was redistributed among the landless farmers. Now this provision required, or this provision violated fundamental right. For example, right to property was fundamental right. But then this, as the government wanted to implement, as the government had the intention to implement land reform, so it required to amend or change right to property or violate the right to property. So this amendment in the year 1951 allowed the government to violate the fundamental right, that is right to property, so as to ensure betterment or welfare for vast or for the majority of farmers. Then the second amendment, or I mean there are many amendments. So far we have had like close to 110 or 15 amendments. More than 100 amendments have been done to the Indian Constitution so far. Then we have amendments like 42nd Amendment, 42nd Amendment. Then we have 42nd Amendment was amended in the year 1976. Then 44th Amendment, then 73rd and 74th Amendment. Now 42nd Amendment was introduced during emergency in the year 1970. This was, this amendment was done in the year 1976, but during emergency, which was from 1975 to 1977. So the 42nd Amendment, it actually gave a lot of power to the Parliament. It made Parliament very, very powerful, and it weakened the power of the judiciary. Then the changes brought in 42nd Amendment were, brought back in the 44th Amendment. So all the changes which were made in the 42nd Amendment were deleted in the 44th Amendment. 73rd, 74th Amendment, we introduced the Panchayati Raj system, which we discussed in the 4th chapter. Panchayati Raj system, Gram Panchayat, Panchayat Samiti, Zilla Parishad, governance for rural administration, then governance for urban areas, municipality, corporation, council, Nagar Panchayat. It was brought in through 73rd and 74th Amendment. So these amendments show how the Constitution adapts to change while ensuring or while keeping its core principles intact. Now let us try to understand the judiciary's role in interpretation, how judiciary interprets the laws made by the Parliament. Now, the judiciary, it plays a very, very important role in keeping the Constitution dynamic. Through judicial review, we have discussed what is judicial review. It's a mechanism through which judiciary can interpret the laws, whether they are constitutional or unconstitutional. The Supreme Court checks if the laws and amendments follow constitutional principles. If a law is unconstitutional, going against constitution, the Supreme Court will strike down the law. Then, for example, we have this concept of basic structure doctrine. Basic structure doctrine. This was the outcome of the Keshavananda Bharati judgment. Now, this doctrine says that Parliament has the power to amend the fundamental rights, but there are some provisions in the Indian Constitution which the Parliament cannot ever change. This is referred to as basic structure. These are the basic, or this is the basic structure principles which cannot ever be amended by the Indian Parliament. For example, we have provisions like Parliament, uh, Parliament, parliamentary governance, secularism, separation of power, judicial independence. So there are some provisions which we cannot, equality, fraternity, justice, which we cannot ever change. Now there are few judgments the Supreme Court has given. For example, first one is the Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case of 1975. Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case of 1975. Now here the Supreme Court struck down a law that prevented judicial review of election disputes. Now what Indira Gandhi did is she made a law stating that judiciary cannot intervene or interpret or cannot look into the election disputes. Judiciary has no power to look into the election disputes. Supreme Court struck down this law stating that judicial review Judicial review is important to ensure judicial independence. Then we have Minerva Mills case of 1980. Now here the Supreme Court ruled that fundamental rights and directive principles must be balanced, which means the Supreme Court has the power to amend the fundamental rights. In order to implement the directive principles, the Supreme Court can amend fundamental rights, but here a balance has to be drawn. Which means in order to implement directive principles, the Parliament cannot outrightly violate the fundamental rights. So these rulings show that judiciary not only protects the constitution but also expands its scope through modern interpretations. For example, uh, the law of our country said that being a lesbian, gay, bisexual is a crime. But now in the year 2018, in the famous, which is that case, again, I'm not able to recall the case, but in one of the famous judgments, the Supreme Court decriminalized LGBTQ community. That is, the Supreme Court declared that being a lesbian, gay, bisexual is not a crime in our country. This is how Supreme Court, expands the rights through modern interpretation. Then we'll discuss the tension between the legislature and judiciary. Right? Now, so on many instances, the parliament has made a law, the Supreme Court has struck it down. And whichever interpretation the Supreme Court comes up with, or declaration, pronouncement, the parliament has overridden the judicial pronouncement or declaration. So there has been always a tussle between judiciary and legislature. I'll explain you one famous case. Now, only the Supreme Court or only the members of judiciary can appoint the Supreme Court and High Court judges. Right? So there's a mechanism through which the judges appoint the judges, which means Parliament does not have any say in the appointment of judges. So in the year 2015, the Parliament made a law with the name NJAC, that is National Judicial Appointment Commission, which allowed for the involvement of members of the government, in the selection process of the judges of Supreme Court and High Court. But here the Supreme Court said that this law is unconstitutional. Why? Because it violates judicial independence. This is how there has always been a tussle between judiciary and legislature. When we start Indian polity, we'll discuss so many cases about the tussle between judiciary and the legislature. I hope you understood how or why Indian constitution is referred to as a living document, because it keeps on changing as per the changing needs of the society. I hope you understood why Indian constitution is referred to as a living document. Now, the philosophy of the Indian constitution. Philosophy of the Indian constitution. Now see, we have discussed that Indian constitution is more than just a legal document. It actually represents a political philosophy. This political philosophy, which philosophies we'll discuss? This political philosophy, it guides the governance in our country, which means the governance in our country, the way our country is governed, is based on political philosophies like liberty, then we have democracy, then we have equality, secularism, federal principles, and all these political philosophies, it ensures that there is justice in the society, there is liberty in the society. So the Indian constitution, we have discussed that it also protects the minorities, especially, and also the historically disadvantaged groups. For example, the scheduled castes, the Dalits, and the tribal groups. Now, the Indian constitution is based on five key principles. Five key principles. What? The Indian constitution is based on five key principles. Which are the five key principles? First one, first one is liberalism. Now, liberalism ensures individual freedoms like freedom of speech, expression, conscience, and people are also protected from arbitrary arrest. Now, this actually is mentioned in Article 21, 22 of the Indian Constitution. Liberalism. People are liberal, country is liberal. Now, this principle is inspired by India's struggle against colonial rule. We opposed when the British were restricting our free speech, when the freedom fighters were fighting for independence, were speaking against the British restricted the rights of individuals or Indians. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of press. People could not assemble together. Then this principle is also influenced by thinkers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who actually brought press freedom in our country. And then we have Mahatma Gandhi, who championed for civil liberties. So first is liberalism. Then we have democracy. Now democracy establishes a representative democracy. What is representative? Which means the elected leaders are elected by the people. Monarchy, Saudi Arabia, we discussed the king's son becomes a king, his son becomes a king. But democracy, anyone can contest the election. For example, our prime minister, he was a chai wala. He used to sell tea. Now today he is the prime minister. So democracy, it grants universal adult franchise, which means everyone who is above the age of 18 can vote. Every citizen has a right to vote. Doesn't matter which religion, caste, creed, nationality you come from. Sorry, not nationality. Religion, caste, gender you come from. Then third one is equality. Now it guarantees equality before the law, which means everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. It prevents or it prohibits, it bans discrimination on the basis of religion, caste, sex, place of birth. It also, this equality also ensures or it provides for substantive equality. What? Substantive equality, which means that, what does it mean? It means that affirmative action, which means the people, the groups who are historically disadvantaged like the scheduled caste and the tribal groups, right? The Indian constitution has the authority to provide certain benefits to these groups so that they can come at par with people from the other groups. Then we have secularism. What is secularism? Which means there is no official religion. In the eyes of the state, each and every religion is equal. The state will not intervene or intervene in the religious matters. The state will not intervene in the religious matters. The state will respect each and every religion. Every person has a right, fundamental right to practice his religion without interference from the state. And the last one is federalism. What is federalism? We already have discussed, right? So I hope you understood the 5 key principles, political philosophies. Now we'll understand what is constitutional morality and democracy. Now, the Indian Constitution promotes constitutional morality, which means that the governance is as per, or the governance is fair, it is ethical, and it is just. Constitutional morality, which means the governance is fair, ethical, and just. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, right, he emphasized that democracy needs more than just laws. It requires responsible leadership. It requires responsible leadership, which means the government is accountable to the people. How? The government is accountable, answerable to the people. How? Through elections, through public participation of the people. So if we open the Indian Constitution, the first page that we come across is the preamble. It's a introduction to the Indian Constitution. This preamble, it prioritizes social, economic, and political justice. If you open the preamble, you can just Google it. It's written justice. Which justice? Social, economic, and political justice. It ensures that democracy is working for everyone, not just the elite section. Right? So these principles help India function as a diverse yet unified nation, despite the differences, be it regional differences, religious differences, ethical differences. So this is what we understand by the term constitutional morality. Now, constitution as an instrument of social change. In order to bring social change, we have constitution as a tool. So we know that constitution is not just a set of laws or rules, it's a tool to transform the society, which means all the discrimination or all the wrong things happening before independence, we decided that we'll remove all this discrimination. We'll remove all this discrimination and we'll work for the welfare of society, that is ensuring social justice. What does it mean? It means that, for example, we have the directive principles of state policy, or the laws that our country should make should be to ensure social justice, which means to ensure no one meets injustice, which means to eradicate poverty, improving the healthcare, promoting education, and ensuring that the poor people, they get fair wages, salaries. Then economic equality. How do you bring change in the society? By ensuring social justice, by ensuring economic equality. And economic equality in principle is not possible. How can people have the same income? But the constitution tries to reduce the economic inequality. For example, we abolished the zamindari system and we have introduced progressive taxation, which means the people who are rich, they have to pay more taxes compared to people who are, let's say, belonging to the middle class or lower middle or poor people. Right? Then empowering the marginalized community. One, two, empowering which means the Dalits and the scheduled tribes. How? By bringing, or let's say by providing reservation in government jobs, in educational institutions, admissions. Then we have people with disabilities, providing them reservation in jobs, then in educational institutions. So this is how you bring a change in the society through constitution, which is a tool. Now let's compare the constitution with other constitutions, right? We know that the Indian constitution is unique. Why? Because it balances individual right with social justice. Now let us discuss how India balances individual rights and social justice. Individual rights and how does India balance individual rights and social justice? See, if we discuss about America, the American Constitution, it focuses mainly on the individual freedoms and limits the government intervention. But if we discuss about India, it combines rights of citizens with social and economic rights, which means it ensures that state can intervene for what? For bringing in equality. This is how India balances individual rights and social justice, where the state can intervene to ensure that the society is just, the society is equal. Then if I talk about, let's say, secularism, right? We know what is secularism. Now, countries like France, they follow strict separation of religion and state. The state cannot intervene in religion. But in India, it allows for religious freedom. It allows for religious freedom while ensuring that state does not discriminate on the basis of religion. On the basis of religion. So, India, for example, we abolished triple talaq. State intervened and it abolished the unjust practice. Then multiculturalism. Now, if I discuss about Canada, it actually recognizes multiculturalism as a state policy. But India, it accommodates the linguistic and religious diversity while promoting national unity. So India again is balancing, which means if we have given the rights to each and every minority, every group to practice their faith, to preserve their culture at the same time, which means we have accommodated the diversity, but ensuring that there is national unity. If the country is not united, what's the point? What is the point of having this diversity? So the main objective is to maintain the unity of the nation. How? By allowing people to have their or preserve their own identity, to preserve their own identities. So this is the philosophy of the Indian Constitution. So students, this is the first part of chapter 5, that is constitutional design. Now in the second part, we'll discuss on the rights mentioned in the Indian Constitution, that is the fundamental rights starting from Article 12 to Article 35. Then we'll also discuss the directive principles of state policy and the fundamental duties as part of the second part of the fifth chapter. I hope you understood all the dimensions that we have discussed in this first part of chapter 5. Right, on this note, I'll call it a wrap. Thank you so much for watching.